Hi, everyone. Welcome to Family Matters. Today's topic is many older adults experience changes in vision. Learn about key environmental modifications that can promote independence. For this episode, we are joined by Jennifer Milsovic, occupational therapist and BCAT coordinator at Mansbach Health Tools, which supports the BCAT Research Center. She has years of experience as a treating occupational therapist and has focused much of her career in vision and cognition in the older adult population. We are glad to have you.
I'm glad to be here.
Great. Well, let's just jump right in. So, you mentioned, we know that you're an occupational therapist. Tell me a little bit about the role of an occupational therapist as it relates to vision.
Sure. Well, Abby, in general, occupational therapists look at how safe, how independent, and how successful people are with everyday tasks. And they look at any underlying factors that may be contributing to breakdown or difficulty in a particular task. So those factors could be a deficit in vision or cognition or balance, as some examples. And then we provide strategies to enable the person to be safer and more independent despite any underlying deficits. So in the example of vision, if somebody's having difficulty managing their medications, let's say, because they can't read a pill bottle, or they can't read the medication instructions, or maybe they can't see the pills easily, an OT could provide strategies or modifications to the task or to the environment to enable the person to independently manage their medications despite any visual limitations. And medication management is really just an example. But OTs look at basic daily tasks like eating and dressing, for example, all the way up to much more complex tasks like driving or managing finances. And I also want to mention that if you're listening, you may have had an experience where an OT was working with your loved one on like remediating or improving visual skills. So for example, maybe they were doing specific eye exercises with them. Sometimes OTs work on remediating or improving those underlying deficits that are contributing to difficulty with daily tasks. And for vision, this could be the case for visual deficits related to something like stroke or brain injury, something where the problem is not in the eye itself, but instead in the brain. And in these cases, targeted exercises can actually help to rewire the brain and improve visual skills. But I want to mention that because today I'm going to talk more about strategies for compensating for vision issues that are more related to the eye itself and aren't necessarily fixable with exercises.
Okay, that is so informative. Thank you. To know that there's different types of eye impairment, the eye itself, or it could be from the brain. Just hearing a little bit about that and occupational therapy, their role in terms of improving, the task at hand and how vision plays such a role. What are some of the common vision changes that you have noticed or experienced that occur as the older adult ages?
That's a great question. So just like other age-related changes, in cognition or physical function, some visual changes associated with the aging process are normal, and some are not normal, but are common. So to start with some of the normal age-related changes in vision, and one change that frequently occurs is a reduction in visual acuity. So acuity meaning how clearly you can see. And it's particularly common to have decreased ability to see closer objects and small print as we get older. And for families listening, you yourself may have been prescribed reading glasses. This change can start happening as early as your 40s. And then along with this comes a need just for increased light to see well as we age. So that's one thing. Another thing that changes with age is a need for increased time for our eyes to adjust when going from light to dark and vice versa. So for example, going from outside on a really bright day to then coming inside to a more dimly lit space or vice versa. Also with age, we typically see a reduction in something called contrast sensitivity. So, contrast sensitivity is the ability to distinguish similarly colored objects against a similar background. So, for example, a white plate on a white counter or a yellow pill in a yellow pill box. And then one other thing that tends to decrease a bit with age is depth perception. And most people are familiar with this term, but depth perception is the ability to appreciate how close or how far an object is to you. And so, for example, you may notice that your older adult is having more trouble pulling into a parking space correctly, or maybe more trouble navigating steps. So those are things that could be a result of decreased depth perception. And then, like I mentioned, some of the visual changes that could happen, but aren't necessarily part of the normal aging process, and are more pathological in nature, might be cataracts. Cataracts are the cloudy areas that can develop in the eye that preclude light from coming through and then in turn cause blurry vision. And actually, cataracts are the most common cause of vision loss in older adults. Another example could be glaucoma, which is an eye disease where increased pressure in the eye causes vision loss. And then one last example would just be macular degeneration, which is the loss of cells in the macula of the eye that results in decreased ability um, to see details and things. But I just want to say it's important to note that these vision changes, whether they're normal or abnormal, can be compounded by other vision impairments due to things like stroke or diabetes. And together, that can really cause a disruption in someone's visual abilities.
So there's many things that can affect the vision changes over a period of time,
Yes.
as you've given examples for. And a lot of these we're familiar with, and some of these could be new. So I appreciate you going into detail about all of these. So now that we know the different types of changes, what impact can these changes have on the older adult functionally over time?
Yeah. So one concern with vision changes with age is the impact that they have on safe mobility and also the impact that they have on a person's independent tasks, both of which can lead to decreased participation in tasks. And really, this can be very cyclic. So, for example, you fall because you can't see where you're going. After a fall, you're afraid to move. So your muscles atrophy and you get weaker. And then you're at even higher risk for another fall. So it's important to address vision issues in older adults to really allow for optimal safety and participation in tasks. And also because we know that decreased participation in tasks can have a really negative effect on cognition.
So when you say mobility, I just want to make sure that the families understand. Do you mean walking? Do you mean being able to go from one place to another? So I just want to, yeah, just
Yeah, no, that's a
make sure
great
we
question.
define that.
Both of those things. So yes, when I say mobility, I really mean walking, ambulating, getting from point A to point B.
Okay. So then other than, that mobility and that
Mhm.
ability to get from point A to point B,
Yeah.
what other daily activities can really be affected by these vision changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. Obviously we rely so heavily on our vision for most activities of daily living. Um, but I would say that there are definitely some tasks that decreased vision can really compromise safety with. So those could be things like managing medications or preparing meals. In the medication example, reduced acuity might make it difficult to read the instructions on a pill bottle. We talked about contrast sensitivity. Reduced contrast sensitivity might make it difficult to see pills in a pill box. And obviously, not taking medications correctly can have pretty major repercussions. And then there are other tasks that, maybe don't have safety repercussions, but they might just be difficult to complete with decreased vision, like reading bills, paying bills, making a grocery list, and I would say really any other daily tasks that involve reading and writing. So it's important to identify areas that your loved one may be having difficulty with or may need some support with because of decreased vision.
So as the older adult ages, vision changes could happen for a variety of reasons. Functionally, there's a lot that could be impacted. What can the family member do to those listening in to help support those loved ones with these vision impairments if they begin to notice these changes? What could they do now?
Yeah, so I would say the first thing that you should do would have your loved one, have your loved one see an eye doctor. Number one, to figure out what's going on, but also because some things are like fixable or at least able to be improved somewhat. So, for example, prescription lenses can help with acuity changes. In the case of something like cataracts, surgery could be helpful. So that would be my first recommendation. Also, just encouraging healthy habits to prevent further vision loss. So, really, the same things that are good for overall brain health are good for visual health. So, good nutrition, managing other medical conditions, like we talked about diabetes, maintaining a healthy weight, not smoking, those sorts of things. So, seeing an eye doctor, encouraging healthy habits, but also, if you're noticing difficulties with specific tasks, so just to use the medication management example again, or preparing meals, asking for a referral to an occupational therapist is a great idea, and your doctor can write a referral for that. Um, as I mentioned earlier, occupational therapists can help find strategies for a person to continue safely and independently completing a task or multiple tasks despite visual limitations. But then there are also some general modifications that you can make to your loved one's environment to make things safer and make the person more independent with tasks.
Okay, great. So then, the title of our talk today is identifying these age-related
Mhm.
changes and then figuring out what those environmental modifications could look like to keep, a person safe. So you can talk a little
Yeah.
bit about, what an occupational therapist would do, and just what are some specific examples of what can family members do to keep a person safe and independent if they do have some of these vision changes.
Sure. Yeah, I love this topic. So let's start with lighting, just because that's a pretty easy fix. And to be honest, it's beneficial for most people, even people with just very mild vision impairments. So you can easily increase lighting in areas, but this is particularly helpful in areas that have lower light, typically like stairways and hallways. And just a note on that, those lower lit areas tend to be where people are at higher risk for falls. Um, Sometimes you can just eyeball an area, you can walk into a hallway or a room and know that there is or isn't adequate light. But if you aren't sure and you really want to investigate, you can actually purchase a light meter at any hardware store, or you can even download an app on your phone that can measure the lumens, which is really just how bright the light is in a particular area. And then you can find online guidelines about how many lumens should be in certain areas, and then what wattage of light bulb would provide that many lumens. So, just to provide a kind of more concrete example of that, so let's say I think my mom's hallway seems pretty dim. I might measure the lumens using an app on my phone and find that they're 300. So then I look online to see, to look at the guidelines, and I find that a hallway should actually optimally have like 750 lumens, which I then see equates to a 60-watt light bulb. So I could change the lighting in her hallway to a 60-watt bulb to optimize her safety. One thing to note about that, though, is that just be sure that the lamp or light fixture that you're adding the light bulb to supports the amount of watts that you're using. Um, Outside of changing light bulbs, there are other options, plenty of other options for adding more light to an area. So, for example, you can add motion sensor lights, which could be helpful at night. Like, for example, in hallways or near a bed, so that when the person gets up in the middle of the night, he or she isn't searching in the dark for a light switch or a lamp and compromising just safety. Um, for areas where there aren't outlets or light fixtures, you can use puck lights, which are just those little circular lights. They can be wall mounted or adhesive. those are particularly helpful in areas like closets or pantries that might not have a light. And then you can use things like rope lighting, which is just what it sounds like, lights on a rope. If there isn't a light fixture or a place for a lamp, which again could be a useful option under a bed for safe mobility at night or on stairs. Um, and just to mention about night, there could be a concern about not wanting to use bright light at night, as to not disrupt the person's circadian rhythms. And there's a bit of a balance here, as of course you want to always strive to promote the best quality sleep in your loved one, but you also don't want the person to fall. So one option here is to look for like a warmer white light for nighttime, which isn't quite as disruptive to a person's circadian rhythms. Um, and then speaking of bright light, if there are areas of glare in the home that are bothersome, so for example, like a really bright overhead light or an eye level light that's causing glare, you can diffuse that light by adding several smaller lights around the room, and that can be beneficial. Do you mind if I say one more thing about?
Go for it. One more.
Okay. So in addition to lighting, another thing that's a fairly easy fix is to increase the contrast in the environment. So steps tend to be an area where adding contrast can be really beneficial. And we talked about contrast sensitivity. If your contrast sensitivity isn't great, it can be difficult to see where one step ends and another step starts. So one thing that you can do to help here is mark the edges of your family members' steps with a strip of colored tape. And this also can be really helpful if somebody has reduced depth perception and is having trouble judging where the edge of the step is. It can also be beneficial on thresholds where there are flooring changes, like from one room to the next. And when I say tape, I'm talking about brightly colored tape. So, one of the best colors here is like a bright neon green, because that's one of the easiest colors for people with vision impairments to see.
Great. Okay, those are really useful tips. Thank you for sharing those.
Sure.
So, kind of switching gears here a little bit, what about if is there any kind of, modification or anything a family member can do? A frequent concern is smaller print. So smaller print, on the medication label, we've been talking about the medication example, or just, a flyer maybe that their doctor had given them, or a card in the mail. So what I know that that's a common concern. Is there anything
Yeah.
that you could recommend that family members or caregivers could do to help in this area?
Yeah, that's great. Because as I alluded to earlier, things with fine print, just what you said, paper materials, pill bottles, screens, TV remotes is a big one. The print on, if you think about like a TV remote, the print below the buttons is usually really, really small. So those are all things that can be problematic for people in terms of function. So let's say that reading smaller print is an issue during things like, we'll come back to managing medications, but paying bills, preparing meals, tasks like that. So for those tasks, there are some lower tech options that can help, and there are some higher tech options that can help. In terms of the low tech things, one common thing that we do as occupational therapists, and it's definitely something that you could do as a family member, is add a tactile cue. And so when I'm saying tactile cue, I'm meaning things that people can feel for instead of just seeing. For things with small print. So you could add a tactile cue, for example, to a button on a microwave or a coffee pot, or even the TV remote. And the most common way of doing this is to use just raised stick-on dots. You can get them on Amazon or any other place like that. So you can stick a raised dot directly on the on-off button of something. In the microwave example, maybe the person uses the reheat button commonly. You could stick it on the reheat button. So they're feeling for the raised dot instead of just having to read the small print on the button. Um, This one's maybe something people are more familiar with, providing large print items. And, of course, this can apply to reading materials like books. But what some people don't realize is they also make things like large print pillboxes, large print clocks, large print playing cards, if that's, a leisure interest of somebody. So there are lots of things outside of books that you can get in large print. And again, just a quick internet search will yield lots of choices there. Then there are also a lot of magnifier options that you can find online. So they make handheld magnifiers. If they make ones that stand on the floor or attach to the table and then are on like an adjustable gooseneck so that you can position it where you need it. So those can be helpful for things like reading pill bottles, newspapers, bills, nutrition labels, expiration dates, important things.
Yeah.
And some, yeah, and some of the magnifiers include light along with the magnification, which, we talked earlier about the importance of good lighting. And then there are, of course, some higher tech options if reading things, small print is difficult or if vision is impaired. And when I'm saying high tech, I would say think about things that fall into kind of like the smart technology gadget camp. So most people are familiar with smart speakers like Alexa. So, in this case, instead of having to look things up perhaps on your phone or on a computer where it might be difficult to see, you can just use your voice to ask Alexa a question. Maybe you ask what the weather is, or maybe you ask what time it is because the clock is too small for you to see. You can even do things like manage your schedule and your calendar using a smart speaker. And then in the even higher tech, more expensive, unfortunately, category, there are voice activated appliances. Everything from microwaves to thermostat, front door locks, televisions, so that you can use voice commands to control things versus having to read the small buttons or screens. And then lastly, kind of in this higher tech category, smartphones have a lot of options for low vision. Things like listening to an audiobook on your smartphone. You can also significantly increase the size of the font on the phone screen. And then there are even newer apps like Seeing AI. I don't know if anybody listening is familiar with that, but that can tell you what you're looking at, or if you hover over something, it can read aloud what you're hovering over so that you don't have to read it.
Very interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of options out there for sure.
Yep.
So we talked about the reading and the small print, and another thing that some families might be concerned about as their loved one gets older, they might be worried about difficulties with driving due to
Yeah.
some of the visual deficits. So I just was wondering if you could touch on that quickly.
Sure, yeah. I think driving is a big topic, and it's a sensitive topic, of course. Um, so keep in mind, vision changes alone can be enough to cause some disruption in driving performance. But then if you pair that with cognitive changes, you may really see a breakdown in driving performance, which I think we all know can ultimately have some pretty major safety repercussions. So just briefly, some indicators that there may be a problem with driving, either from a visual or cognitive perspective, could be things like, you're noticing that the person's drifting out of their lane frequently, pulling out when another vehicle is too close, bumping curbs, going excessively slowly. Sometimes people will slow way down because it takes them longer to process visual information, which could be visual, could be cognitive, could be both. And just in general, having a lot of like close calls or near misses. So I would say if you're noticing any of these things or anything else that feels to you like a red flag, it would be a good idea to talk to your family member's doctor about getting a prescription for a driving evaluation. And in a driving evaluation, which is usually done by an occupational therapist or an OT, the OT will first do an assessment in the clinic where he or she will look at the person's vision, their cognition, and their physical function, particularly as those things relate to driving. If all that looks okay, the next step is a behind the wheel assessment where the OT will actually take the person out driving, usually starting in a parking lot and then kind of going through increasingly complex traffic environments to observe the person's performance. And then after the evaluation, the OT will make a recommendation about driving. So the outcome may be a recommendation to continue driving as is, perhaps to continue driving, but with some restrictions like no nighttime driving or stay within a particular radius of the home. Or the OT may recommend that this is the time to retire from driving. If driving retirement, if that recommendation is the case, the OT will typically provide resources for alternate means of transportation so that the person can still get where they need to go.
Okay, great. So you've provided some red flags that the family can look for. Plus, if they're noticing any kind of overall, changes, with vision, they can always reach out, to a specialist, or even a referral to the physician to figure out next steps. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so last question. Are there any considerations that family members should maybe keep in mind when making any of the environmental or task modifications that you've mentioned today?
Yeah, yeah. So, one thing to consider, especially with some of the higher tech things that I mentioned, is that there may be a learning curve. So, a very well-intentioned modification may end up being really frustrating for the person if they're having trouble using or learning it. And this could especially be the case if someone has cognitive impairments along with their visual
Mhm.
impairments. And but really, even for the things that I mentioned that aren't high tech, some practice may be needed to successfully use the strategy or the modification. So, for example, something that even seems as benign as just putting tape on the edge of the steps may be something that needs a little bit of practice to use successfully. Um, then also, I really think that we should be considering how people might feel about having some of these modifications made to their space and balance that with safety. So, uh, I think the answer to that is just having a conversation before coming in and taping people's steps and, increasing their light, things like that.
Right.
And just lastly, keep in mind, these are everything that I mentioned really are general recommendations. They may or may not be appropriate for your loved one. So this is where it really could be beneficial to consult with an occupational therapist to find the modification that's best for your family member.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Jen, for taking the time to share with our families all of your knowledge and expertise. I'm really sure that our families value your input on this topic, and you've really provided great information, things to be aware of, and some recommendations that they could use right now. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and stay tuned for our next Family Matters episode. Goodbye.